God morgon. Klockan är 8.30 och Ulrika Aun och jag vill tillsammans med rektor Anders Fällström som representanter för Mittuniversitetet börja med att hälsa er alla varmt välkomna till Rektorsprogrammets Rikskonferens 2021. Mitt namn är Susanne Salin. Jag är utbildningschef på Rektorsprogrammet vid Mittuniversitetet och jag kommer tillsammans med mina kollegor att varsamt försöka lotsa oss igenom den här dagen. Vi har just fått se en film med utsikten över Storgatan, Stenstan och in mot campus Sundsvall för att försöka skapa en liten glimt av Mittuniversitetet och Sundsvall. Den här gången då ses vi digitalt, men jag hoppas och tror att vi genom RP21 under de här åren att vi tillsammans ska kunna samverka på många olika sätt och att då även få chansen att bjuda in er till Mittuniversitetet vid ett senare tillfälle. Temat för årets rikskonferens det är rektorer som en professionell yrkesgrupp i skola och förskola. Och programmet innehåller en kortare föreläsning med ett internationellt perspektiv. Och sen resten av dagen då har vi ett nationellt perspektiv. Och vi kommer att få ta del av och diskutera olika kapitel i vår gemensamma antologi att jobba som rektor. Och vi kommer också att ha ett längre kunskapserfarenhetsutbyte om RP21 i slutet av dagen. Och förutom det så blir det en del rörelsepaus, en del underhållning och lite pauser för skärmvila och kanske kaffepåfyllning. Men nu vill jag bolla över till Ulrika Auno för lite praktisk information om dagen.
Tack Susanne. Ja, Ulrika Auno heter jag och är administrativt ansvarig för Mittuniversitetets rektorsprogram. Och också verksamhetsledare för Mittuniversitetets RUK som hos oss heter Regionalt utvecklingsnätverk, eller RUN. Jag ser precis som Susanne fram emot en inspirerande dag tillsammans med er. För att vi alla ska få ut mesta möjliga av dagen så rekommenderar jag att ni har programsidan öppen under dagen. Den sida där ni har programmet och där ni har länkar till de olika delarna i programmet. Den länksidan heter mion.se/rpriks-final. Och den länken hittar ni i ert välkomstmail och i den Outlook-inbjudan som ni också har fått ut. Vi börjar dagen här i Youtube. Men när vi senare under dagen ska arbeta tillsammans i grupper så kommer vi att gå över till Zoom. Och när vi befinner oss i Zoom då är det bra att ni tänker på att ha namn och lärosäte skrivet på er digitala namnskylt. Och hur man gör det finns det instruktioner för på den här program- och länksidan. Så det kan ni titta på där. På länksidan så har ni programmet och i programmet ligger det blå knappar. Man klickar på knappen för respektive programpunkt så kommer man in i rätt rum under dagen. Administratörsgruppen har ett eget program under eftermiddagen och det programmet ligger längst ner på den här program- och länksidan och där hittar ni era blå knappar. Det kan ju vara så att man behöver teknisk support under dagen och då går det bra att mejla till run@mion.se så får man hjälp där. Sist men inte minst så skulle jag ju vilja rekommendera att ni också har ert konferenskit nära till hands under dagen. Där har ni lite konferensgodis som ni kan njuta av men också lite utrustning inför magiska inslag som händer senare under dagen tillsammans med Arcadia. Ja, men jag tror att det får räcka så Susanne med det praktiska och så tar vi det eftersom helt enkelt.
Tusen tack Ulrika, det låter spännande tycker jag. Jag vill också passa på att tacka dig och den arbetsgrupp som har arbetat extra mycket med planeringen av årets rikskonferens. Så mitt varmaste tack till dig Ulrika, till Maggie Sandin och till Marsha Håkansson Linkvist. Vi hade inte kunnat göra det här utan er. Men innan vi går vidare i programmet för dagen, då vill jag hälsa Mittuniversitetets rektor Anders Fällström varmt välkommen.
Tack, tack. Och jag skulle också, det är tredje gången ni blir hälsade välkomna till Mittuniversitetet och till Sundsvall. Staden mellan bergen där hav möter berg, stenstad möter vildmark och staden där ett av de 7 lärosäten som utbildar framtidens rektorer har ett campus. Så skulle jag ju vilja hälsa er välkomna idag. Jag hade verkligen velat att ni skulle kunna vara på plats här allihopa. Precis som Susanne sa. Ett solbadande vackert Sundsvall som förmodligen hela Sverige är idag. Men tyvärr är ju läget fortfarande sånt att det inte är möjligt. Men jag vill i alla fall önska er varmt och hjärtligt välkomna till Mittuniversitetet och vårt, får vi väl säga, virtuella campus. En väl fungerande skola, det är ju samhällets fundament. Och det är vad allas vår framtid bygger på. Därför är det inte konstigt att lärarutbildningen är i mina ögon vår kanske viktigaste utbildningar. Men lärare, de måste ju också ha förutsättningar att göra det fantastiskt viktiga arbete som de har att utföra. Och dessa förutsättningar, det är skolledarens eller rektorns uppgift att grunda. Det handlar om allt ifrån organisation, ekonomi till rekrytering, personalfrågor, kvalitetsarbete och mycket, mycket mer. Synnerligen komplexa roller, tror jag. Att Mittuniversitetet och skulle jag tro alla 7 lärosäten som nu ger rektorsprogrammet kan erbjuda ett komplett utbildningspaket omfattande utbildningar från förskollärare via grund- och ämneslärare till, vi får väl idag säga kronan på verket, rektorsutbildningen. Det är inte bara en fjäder i hatten, något som vi är väldigt stolta över, utan det är också något mycket viktigt för vår region, liksom säkert era regioner, och för hela Sverige som land. Jag var under några år ordförande i styrgruppen för Mittuniversitetets rektorsutbildning. Förutom att det var väldigt roligt, intressant och stimulerande för mig, så var det också ett av de uppdrag jag tyckte var allra viktigast och som jag nog var stoltast över. Att vi som universitet har möjlighet att utbilda dagens och framtidens rektorer, det är för mig verkligen en hjärtefråga. Och något som ger en känsla av att vi ägnar oss åt de riktigt viktiga frågorna för samhällets framtid. Men att göra det på egen hand, det skulle inte bli lika bra, vare sig för Mittuniversitetet, för vår region eller för landet. Och är det någonting jag brinner för och som jag tycker det finns alldeles för lite av, så är det större samverkan mellan olika svenska lärosäten, universitet och högskolor. Att rektorsprogrammet under så lång tid visat ett mycket gott samverkansklimat och att vi 7 nu tillsammans med Skolverket fortsätter detta, det värmer mitt universitetsrektorshjärta lite extra och gör mig än tryggare att framtidens skola kommer fungera mycket väl. Vi finns för att vara med och utveckla samhället. Att se till att vårt skolsystem håller högsta kvalitet, det är som sagt kanske det viktigaste av allt. Och att vi därför kan samverka och samarbeta kring rektorsprogrammet, det både glädjer mig och tycker jag är väldigt viktigt. Att vara ledare, det må vara rektor i skolan eller rektor och myndighetschef för ett universitet, det handlar ju om att skapa förutsättningar. Förutsättningar för sin organisation att utföra ett så gott arbete som möjligt och nå så viktiga mål som möjligt. Att leda en sån här konferens, det handlar också om att skapa förutsättningar. Förutsättningar för att alla vi deltagare ska få ut så mycket som möjligt av den. Och det är jag övertygad om att våra arrangörer har gjort och gör. Och därför vill jag också tacka er, Ulrika, Susanne och er övriga så jättemycket för den här dagen. Och därför är det inte bara en önskan utan det är vetskap om att vi nu kommer att få en fantastiskt givande dag. Jag önskar som sagt bara att vi alla hade kunnat vara på plats i Sundsvall. Men jag vet att Mittuniversitetsandan kommer att sväva över hela dagen. Ytterligare förgylla denna konferens. Och både Sundsvall och Mittuniversitetet står kvar. Så ni är varmt välkomna till dagen i detta forum och framtiden till Sundsvall. Varmt välkomna.
Tusen tack Anders och tack för att du tog dig tid att vara med här och inleda vår rikskonferens. Det känns värdefullt. Och precis som Anders nämnde så är ju samverkan viktigt för oss. Mittuniversitetets vision det är att vara ett globalt universitet med ett regionalt engagemang där vi forskar och utbildar för hela livet. På tal om det här kompletta utbudet som Anders nämnde. Och ett mål i universitetets strategi det är ju att öka och utveckla vår samverkan internt, regionalt, nationellt och internationellt. Och som ett led i det har vi inom rektorsprogrammet under några år strategiskt arbetat för att utveckla vår internationella samverkan. Det har lett till idag ett pågående samarbete med UCL i London, med NTNU i Trondheim, och från och med i år har vi också förmånen att ha professor Tony Busch som vår gästprofessor på institutionen för utbildningsvetenskap och som en del i vår forskningsgrupp utbildningsledarskap och skolutveckling. Och det här vill vi ju gärna dela med oss av i någon form. Och därför har vi bjudit in Tony Busch idag för att dela med sig av ett mer internationellt perspektiv på rektorsprofessionen. Och innan jag går över till engelska och introducerar dagens gästföreläsare eller keynote speaker så vill jag påminna er om att använda er av den här padleten som finns samlad på programsidan eller länksidan, tror jag Ulrika nämnde, för att kunna ställa frågor och funderingar inför frågestunden som kommer efter Tonys presentation. Och jag försöker sedan att vara moderator och ställa de här frågorna till Tony. Och blir det många frågor så får jag göra ett litet urval. Och nu ser ni också i bild en QR-kod som ni kan använda er av. Och annars finns den alltså på programsidan. Då byter vi till engelska. I'm now very proud and happy to present our keynote speaker for today, our guest professor, Professor Tony Busch, Nottingham University in England. Professor Busch is a professor in educational leadership. He is also, as many of you know, the editor of the journal Educational Management, Administration and Leadership. He is also the president of the British Educational Leadership, Management and Administration Society, short BELMAS. Professor Busch has worked worldwide and has been a consultant, external examiner, and an invited keynote speaker or research director in more than 23 countries. Very impressive, I would say. And so, today he is invited to give us some international perspectives on the principal profession. Tony, you are very warmly welcome to our national conference today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be given the opportunity to join this important conference today. And I hope you will have a good day, and I look forward to your responses to what I have to say. I think that's all by way of introduction now, and I can now see the presentation, which is a relief. So as you can see, and Suzanne has already indicated, I intend to look at aspects of the principal profession from an international perspective. So I'm hoping that I can now move this on. I don't know, John, whether you can help me with this. I can't seem to move it on from this slide to the next one. Oh, thank you very much. Don't go away. Please stay there. So this is what I'm going to try to do this morning, and as it says here, provide an international perspective on roles and responsibilities of school principals, and with a number of aspects there, obviously focusing on leadership preparation, which is central to the work that many of you do, and related issues around the recruitment and selection of principals, looking at some theoretical understandings around their work, including notions of socialization and identity. Then to look at some aspects of leadership practice and styles. Particularly want to focus in one slide on novice principals, challenges and opportunities there. And that's partly because, as I understand it, the client base for principals programs in Sweden mainly focus on these novice principals. And then to say something briefly about professional learning before turning again briefly to looking at issues of shared leadership, because although the focus here is on principals, and indeed the main focus on leadership globally is on school principals, increasingly there are other leadership roles that are also very important in effective schooling. Thank you. Please try and move on to the next one, John, if you can do so for me. So let's begin with issues around leadership preparation then, just a few thoughts here. I think one of the key developments and in understanding over the last decade or so has been this notion that a principal is not just teacher plus. So in the language used in the UK and in many other parts of the world, the phrase head teacher is used. And one can understand that, but that implies a teacher plus approach to the principal's role. And increasingly it's being recognized that it's not simply teacher plus. It's quite a distinctive professional role. And I've been making that point in some of my own writing over the last few years. Another key issue then relates to whether or not leaders should be qualified, and experience around the world varies enormously. So some countries require a leadership qualification before you can even practice as a principal, and I've given some examples on the screen, and they're really from all over the place, aren't they? Canada, China, France, Hong Kong, Malaysia, where I've worked quite a lot, Singapore, where I used to be an external examiner, and the USA. They're all places that require a leadership qualification. And I think the understanding of this is that we wouldn't expect other senior professionals in other fields to practice without being qualified. And I think that's really very important. We expect our teachers to be qualified, do we not? We expect doctors to be qualified, especially in the time of a pandemic such as we're now experiencing. And we expect others to be qualified, so why not principals? And the fact that Sweden's taken this on board with its program, I think, is really significant and important, but it's by no means worldwide. So other systems sometimes require post-appointment training. Sweden, I think, is an example of that. But many other places require no specific training at all, and the only qualifications required would often be a teacher qualification with some teaching experience. Another variable across the world is where people locate leadership preparation and development activity. So this might be provided by universities, as in Sweden, but specialist centres as well. I'm becoming involved in something quite new. There's a new African Centre for Educational Leadership located in Rwanda, and that's a sort of regional development, but there are plenty of other examples of national leadership centres, for example, in Malaysia and in Singapore and now in Chile. So much depends on what we see the purpose of preparation to be, and particularly in centralised systems, preparation is increasingly focused around administrative conformity rather than instructional or professional leadership. So that's a key issue to think about when programs are being designed. What purposes are they intended to fulfill? Thank you, John. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So just a few case examples here. I'm conscious of limited time, but I thought it'd be useful to illustrate some of the points I've been making already. These are extracts from the literature. So a certificate for principalship is a requirement in Hong Kong, as you can see. There's evidence of increasing recognition that principals require specialized preparation, as in Cuba. Even in what we might see to be a very disadvantaged context, as for example in Ethiopia, this postgraduate diploma in school leadership is required to professionalize the principalship, and I do think that phrase of professionalizing the principalship is really important. Similarly, there's a similar program in Ireland delivered through universities, and now here I go into dangerous territory, and I'm citing Göteborg 2021. I have no idea whether Göteborg 2021 is on the call, but I'm in the paper published there, as you see, continuous learning, training intertwined with practice, but also interrupted learning with discontinuities between program participation and leadership practice. So the issue there about having continuous or discontinuous training, I think, is quite interesting. And of course, I guess almost all of you on the call will know more about this than I do. But interesting perhaps for you to know that the work around this is being published in international journals. And the kind of just reflection for you at this time of this conference, what is the right timing for principal preparation and who should provide it? So that there is a pre-service model in many places where people are required to be trained before they can become principal. In other cases, and as I understand it in Sweden, there's a post-appointment entitlement to principal development activity. And so there's an issue around which of those is better, although that may very well be contextual. So can we move on to the next one, please, John? So something about recruitment and selection. It's obvious, isn't it, that having high quality principals would depend a lot on having appropriate recruitment and selection criteria. And so there are some differences here. I make a distinction between individual agency, where principals apply for the position of principal, and so that they make a personal decision to do this. And that's certainly the case here in England. In many centralized countries, though, particularly where professionals are civil servants, they may simply be deployed as principals and have little or no control over their own career. In some of the work I've done in Africa, we've become aware of principals who have been moved at a week's notice from their current school to another one for the first time principalship, and feel really lacking in confidence, inevitably, of taking up a new role in a new school with no preparation. There are those writers who said that is morally wrong to do that. So what are the criteria for being appointed? So first of all, the notion of being qualified, however that's defined, but also the issue of acceptability. And in some contexts that links to kinship or political affiliation being more important than professional qualifications and attributes. So professional attributes may be paramount or they may be subordinated. I have some examples of that on the next slide, please, John. So one of my PhD students, Sarah Zhu, has just finished her doctorate on leadership preparation in China. And we've recently had that accepted for publication. And what was very significant about the work, the way that political affiliation is seen to trump professional knowledge and skills. So principals have to be qualified, they have to go through programs, and Sarah's PhD describes that very well. But when it comes to the appointment process, however well qualified you are, you won't be appointed if you're not a member of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's an example of political affiliation trumping professional knowledge and skills. Similarly, in Ethiopia, political affiliation is very important. What's interesting in the US, and we all will have followed this on our news screens over the last several years, the issue of securing the fit, I guess it would be part of your debate in the work that you are doing, getting the right fit between candidate and context. So yes, you may be qualified, but what about the fit? So are you an appropriate candidate for a specific context, urban or rural, for example, large school, small school, primary school, secondary school? But at the same time, in talking about fit, there's evidence also of bias around that. So you might only fit if you are male, you might only fit if you are white. And so the challenges there of gender or racial discrimination are quite real and challenging for many. Qatar has an interesting example that there's growing awareness of the importance of leadership preparation in many parts of the Middle East, and for example, Bahrain now has its own National School Leadership Center. In Qatar is interesting. The great majority of professionals working in schools in Qatar are not Qatari nationals, but you cannot be a principal unless you are. So you need to be a Qatari national as well as completing their national qualifications program. A little interesting point from Spain around the issue of intrinsic motivation. Again, obviously, people really must want to do it to be successful as principals, rather than feeling they have to do it. And there's, as we'll see later, there is mounting evidence around the world around the pressures involved in being a principal, the long hours that many principals have to work, and the dangers of burnout. That's a challenge. But noting here also the increasing expectations in relation to administrative demands, which would be a feature of many systems. And English principals, for example, feel ground down by the bureaucracy. and the high stakes accountability pressures that they face. So can we please go on then, John? Thank you. So I said earlier about just trying to frame the discussion around principles a little bit in terms of theory. We don't really have time to do this in any depth, but just to introduce three areas of socialization, and I'm sure this is very much in your minds as people involved in developing principles. So first of all, the professional aspects of socialization, acquiring the knowledge and skills needed to perform the role. And most leadership preparation programs that I know focus to a considerable extent on this part. A range of knowledge and skills, so the knowledge will be around instructional leadership, around financial management, for example, around the skills required to manage staff, and engage in accountability procedures, both with government and with clients such as parents and students. The second aspect of socialization then is organizational. So how do you develop an understanding of the specific context where leadership is enacted? The advantage of providing training and development following appointment, which is, as I understand it, is what happens in Sweden, is that the training can focus on the organizational aspects of socialization as well. If you're in a pre-service training model, the candidates very often do not know where they'll be practicing leadership, and so cannot readily do organizational aspects of socialization. So I think that's an advantage of doing a program for novice principals in their first few years after appointment. The third aspect is much more difficult, really, around the personal development. How does an individual develop a principal persona or identity when they were previously a teacher, or perhaps they're a middle leader or senior leader, and is distinct from that of a teacher? This is particularly challenging, the research shows, where teachers or middle leaders are appointed to become principal in their current school, when everyone, all the stakeholders, all the teachers recognize them in a different role, and then suddenly they take on this more senior role. And that process of adaptation is difficult for the person concerned and for their role set. And again, I don't have time to go into this in detail, but there's an interesting paper by Tubin around how identity is developed. And she talks about a construction process, then a formation process, and then enactment, and making it work. Thank you. Next slide, please. So again, a few case examples to try and kind of bring these ideas to life in different contexts. So there's a systematic review that has been done by Cruz Gonzalez, published in my journal, which you might find interesting. The notion of the dual identities touches on what I've just been talking about. So your professional career has been that of a teacher, and now you become a principal. And so in a sense, you don't stop having a teacher identity, but you graft onto it an identity as a school principal. That's quite an interesting way of looking at it in that paper. Again, I'm treading into your territory with this paper by Murakami and Thomson. And I ask you to think about whether it's even true. They say school leadership in Sweden is male dominated. You might want to introduce that into the discussion after we've finished. But I think globally there's an issue around with teaching being very much a gendered profession around the world, particularly so in early years and primary schools, but increasingly so in secondary schools as well. What about this situation where principalship remains male dominated and women remain underrepresented at that level compared to the percentage of teachers who are women? So interesting issues, and a whole range of important research has been carried out to try to analyse why that may be. I've mentioned already the issue of identity construction by Tobin, and Tobin, she talks about that being not a one-off process, but one that is an ongoing process. And similarly, Robertson in New Zealand talks about professional identity being transformed through experience. Very much the same idea of it being ongoing or continuing. And again, Murphy's talking about having both formal and informal elements of professional socialization. Next slide, please. So moving on to issues of leadership styles and practice, and maybe how principals lead their schools. one of the interesting aspects for leadership preparation programs is whether providers such as yourselves develop a normative perspective on how people should lead their schools, or whether those issues are left more open so that individuals can interpret that in relation to both their own personal experience and values, and also in terms of the school context where they are going to be leading or where they are already leading. So it connects to what I said earlier about professional socializations, learning to lead, and also to what I call here sensitive situational analysis, learning to lead in a specific school. And I've done a considerable amount of work, as some people will know, on theories of educational leadership, but what we've come to understand is the need for contextual adaptation rather than one-size-fits-all styles. So I think it's valuable for programs of the kind that you are running to provide a toolkit, provide a list of a set of ideas that people might use, but then the skill of leadership is knowing when to operate in a particular way in relation to a particular context and a specific event. But what I think you will all know from the literature and the research is the increasing prominence of instructional, transformational and distributed approaches to leadership. There's more research and literature on those models than on any other models available, and particularly in the 21st century, distributed and instructional leadership have become very prominent and are normatively expressed in some education systems. For example, in Malaysia, where I've done 2 recent research projects. So next slide, please. So again, some examples here. Q8, I think, is a very interesting example of a highly centralized system, seen as implementers of top-down imposed change. You could see that as being very common across all centralized systems, and Q8 illustrates that. But significantly, they want more input. I'm not sure in that context or in other centralized contexts how you feed back that wish to have more input when most communication is top-down rather than bottom-up. Similar issues arise in Q8's neighbor in Saudi Arabia, where Al-Qahtani talks about traditions weighing heavily on principles and most leadership decisions coming from the top. I'm not sure if you would have had the chance to see Kate Thornton's paper on leadership in COVID-19. Of course, what we're seeing now is the beginning of a body of literature talking about leadership, essentially crisis leadership, as a result of the COVID pandemic. So the rapid responses required, the technological change, the need for compassion and so on. It's quite interesting in that context. And then Reid talks about sense-making being important for engagement with stakeholders. I see sense-making as being connected to notions of organizational socialization. And in a recent paper, Canal talks about Nepal, and Nepal's a very underpublished context. And it's going through a real crisis with COVID-19 at the moment, as are many places. Canal and his colleagues talk about different leadership frames, as different ways of understanding as a way to inform decisions. Thank you. Can we move on? I said at the beginning that I'd try to say something about novice principles in particular, because I think that's mainly the client base for the programs that are being run in Sweden. There's quite a lot of difference in the kind of definitions that you see. So who's a novice principal? Some will talk about it being the first year, some will talk about 5 years. But most often in the literature, the definition relates to the first 3 years of experience for novice principals. And just a few ideas here around what challenges they face in that period. So first of all, the political and administrative expectations, called learning the game. And such expectations are sometimes outlined in job specifications, for example, or simply expected through oral communication with whoever the superordinate is outside the school. There's then the issue of further adaptation to role set expectations, again part of organizational socialization, to become aware of the expectations of teachers, parents, students, community, and other potential stakeholders, and particularly coping with the challenges faced when those expectations differ, and making judgments about how to make the best of those competing expectations. The other issue that's come right to the fore in the last year and a half, of course, with COVID, is how do you balance student learning with welfare concerns? So the big focus on instructional leadership over the last few years, with expectations around examination performance, for example, and illustrated very strongly through the PISA international rankings on language, on mathematics and science, creates challenges. How much pressure do you then place on children to get better results, even if that has challenges for welfare concerns, or because it leads to an impoverished curriculum that focuses only on what is measured and ignores co-curricular activities, ignores sport, drama, music, and so on, which may be much more helpful to student welfare and self-worth. And then connected to that, increasing evidence in the literature and research about principals feeling stressed, feeling isolated, feeling lonely, being burned out, wanting to retire early, and particularly the issue of isolation, not knowing who to share with, because they're principal, they're seen as knowing everything by people in the organisation, and that's a pressure that is very difficult for principals to face. Okay, thank you. Can we move on to the next one? So again, just some examples of the situation facing novice principals as reflected in research and literature. So in Ireland, for example, Murphy talks about anticipatory socialization as a key to adaptation. So the anticipatory socialization is really two things. Firstly, anticipation when you embark on a professional learning program in order to prepare to be a principal. And then a second level of anticipatory socialization when you begin to practice as a principal in a particular context. So there's quite a bit of sort of reframing going on there from both of those ideas, switching from a teacher perspective to a principal perspective, and then thinking carefully about how you enact the role in a particular context. So in some work that I did with George Ojuro in Africa, quite a long time ago now, 15 years ago, what we found then, and I don't think this has really changed, is new principals are underprepared and feel isolated. And there are plenty of narratives around principals there being sent to a new school to become principal when they've never been a principal before and never trained to be a principal, and asking the key question, what am I supposed to do now? Very much learning on the job and learning under pressure. I've been involved over the last few years in working with the 2 national school leadership centres in Chile, and also working with the ministry there around principal preparation. But what is interesting in the study produced by Galdame is, and it's a phenomenon that occurs elsewhere as well, the new principals are often placed in the ineffective or what they call sinking schools. And there's an interesting development there, isn't there? So you take the least experienced principals, the new ones, and you place them in the most challenging contexts. There's some evidence of this also in New Zealand, where new principals are generally placed in rural schools that more experienced principals don't want to go there. And so they're interesting about what is the moral perspective behind all that. So new principals placed in ineffective, sinking schools, and some of the work I've done there and others have done there shows that these principals are being set up to fail. They've got no experience of being principals. They would have had some training in that context, and then they're put in the most challenging schools. And they're also faced with a contract which is based on student outcomes. And if they don't reach those contracts, they can be dismissed. So there's a very, if we think about the notion of the carrot and the stick, the Chile model is one where the stick is emphasized, and there's huge pressure on new principals to perform in very, very, very challenging contexts. In Australia, principals faced what's described here as burnout. I've mentioned that already, well-being challenges, and of course exacerbated by the COVID issues, limited job satisfaction. All that is extremely challenging, and not a recipe for being happy and content in your wider life, let alone as a professional. And then the Mahfouz paper around principals experiencing guilt, unfairness, loneliness and disappointment. It's little wonder, isn't it, that in many countries around the world, principal positions cannot be filled, let alone filled with highly capable and highly motivated colleagues. And it's a challenge, I think, for principal preparation programs to help new principals to work their way through these challenges and find a way of working that's effective for them. I'm sure you face that challenge all the time. So next slide, please. So just a little bit here about wider professional learning. So it's easy to assume that if people complete a leadership qualification, then they're good to go. They're ready to go. They're qualified. The qualification is publicly known. So in England, we have the National Professional Qualification for Headship. And when you go to schools and you see the board outside the school, it gives the name of the principal, and behind it, it says NPQH. And that's a way of assuring parents and others that the principal is qualified. But it's threshold qualification, isn't it? It's not now I know everything. Now I'm fully skilled and so on. It can never be like that. So the need for professional learning to be ongoing, continuing professional development, is just the same for principals as it is for teachers, where it's more widely recognized. And I've just given a few examples here of why things are changing. So you may need training to address new policies or developments, and of course the switch to online learning during COVID-19 for schools and indeed for universities. Conscious of this from my own work here. It's very significant. That's been hugely challenging. And excuse me, my computer wants to turn itself off, so I'm just going to stop it doing that. So to address those new policies or developments, and how do you do that? And how do you develop in a principals program those sets of awareness that relate to ability to be adaptive? And COVID-19 is a striking example of that, but the need to be adaptive is quite important all the time. Second issue would be when principals are appointed to a second school. So in England, quite often heads during their careers might have 2, 3, even 4 headships. And it's too simple to assume that what worked well in school A will necessarily work well in school B. There's more learning required to adapt to a new school. And we've had experience here and in other parts of the world. I know this is true in China and also in the US, where education systems encourage or require successful principals to move to an underperforming school in order to turn it round. So there's a body of literature, and you may well be aware of this, around turnaround leadership. But what we know about this is that it's very mixed. The evidence is very mixed about that work, how well that works. So you might do well in school A, you go to school B, which is different, and you don't succeed in turning it around. So what worked well in the previous context didn't work well in the second context. So it's that simplistic assumption that the attributes of principalship are individual, That's the assumption behind a turnaround leadership model, where actually much of what's required in principles is contextual, not individual. Certainly those two aspects need to be married. So the third issue would then be about to learn about leadership practice and innovations in other contexts, like one of the advantages of conferencing, like today, or like the good old days when you could actually meet people for a coffee during the breaks, is the notion of learning from each other. And I think one of the advantages of running professional development programs for principals that you are doing is that principals can learn from each other as well as from those of you who are involved in facilitating such programs. I think that's I think you will be aware and know about that anyway. And then just the fourth point, if you're feeling burned out, if you're feeling isolated, if you're feeling lonely, how do you refresh, renew and extend professional capacity and capability? We had a program in England a long time ago which has been abandoned now, of people having 6 months away from the role of principal in a 7-year period. Such a program still operates in Singapore. So there is structured opportunities for refreshment and renewal. And this might include, as it does in Singapore, visits to other countries, for example, so that they can become aware, have time away from the pressures of the school and be able to step back and reflect. Even as academics, we don't have as much time to reflect as we might need. And I think that's even more true for very busy professionals such as school principals. So I think we underestimate, I think, that. By never giving people a break, you kind of almost build in burnout into the role that school principals have to carry out. So next one, please. So just some case examples. In Australia, O'Neill and Glasson talk about experienced principals being thirsty for professional development to rejuvenate them. And I think that's a very interesting couple of comments there that I put in the inverted commas. So they want to rejuvenate, they're thirsty to rejuvenate. And that's facilitated in the way I spoke about a few minutes ago in relation to stepping away and stepping back for a while in order to do that. In contrast, in New Zealand, leadership learning is tacit, and there's little opportunity for critical reflection, something I mentioned a few minutes ago. And there's not much literature about school leadership in Germany, but it's beginning to emerge. And interesting, significant there that Klein and Schwanenberg see the role switching from administration to leading school improvement. That's, I think, a reflection of what we see in many systems. The perceived development needs, though, are modest. Just want to put one caution in on this phrase of role shifting from administration to leading school improvement. Many systems say this, but increasingly there's evidence that it's normative and it's rhetoric. And principals are still expected to engage in a considerable amount of time on fulfilling the administrative expectations of the system, which inevitably reduces the time available for instructional leadership and school improvement. Thank you. Next slide, please. I think it might be the last one. No, it's not quite, nearly. So I said something earlier about the way in which leadership development provision focuses on the principal, as indeed does your program, as I understand it, in Sweden. This is widespread. Behind it is the assumption that the principal is the only leader. I don't mean that within the profession, by the way. I mean without outside the profession, and particularly in government. The other reason for doing this, of course, is that budgets are always limited. If you've got limited budgets, focusing on the principal rather than other leaders is totally understandable. Because at least in theory, principals can cascade the learning to their other leaders, although there's not much evidence of this being done in any systematic way. What we do know around the world is schools have an extensive leadership apparatus which is growing. Schools have deputy principals, sometimes called associate principal or assistant principals. They have middle leaders who are called heads of department or subject heads or heads of welfare or pastoral. The language varies, but the notion of having senior and middle leaders is really very commonplace. And Suzanne mentioned earlier that I've done a lot of international work, and a great privilege for me to be able to do that. What you see in international context, though, is a leadership structure which is really very similar across the globe. And the principle, there's not an education system in the world that doesn't have schools, first of all, and then doesn't have a school principal, whatever they call the person. So it's very much a universal construct. Excuse me. What we also see then is in many contexts that in practice there is teamwork. There's something called a senior leadership team, a senior management team, a school management team, or whatever. And indeed this teamwork is quite bizarre. This teamwork is sometimes prescribed. So in some work I did a few years ago on school leadership teams, as they were called, in South Africa, the membership of the leadership team was prescribed by government, and the role was prescribed by government. But what we found in really quite extensive research in one province was that these school leadership teams rarely met. So they were notional. So when we asked them about leadership team practice, we found that they met very rarely. Whereas in England, they would meet weekly. In South Africa, they might meet monthly, they might meet once a term, they might meet once a year, they might never meet. And so the interesting thing is, how do you make leadership teamwork effective in the absence of meetings? And what it falls down to is that individuals have roles which they conduct, and it's the work that they do individually that's more significant than the work they do collectively. But what principals have to do, because there is so much work to do and there is so much pressure on principals, is to learn how to work effectively with senior and middle leaders to build what's often called leadership density. Some evidence, for example, from the Leithwood et al. Work from 2006, which has recently been brought up to date in a paper in 2020, the notion of building leadership density, more leaders, other things being equal, leads to more effective leadership. And some of you will know about the 7 strong claims part of their research. 2 of those claims refer directly to leadership distribution. So what you may see when principals are working effectively with senior and middle leaders is leadership distribution, or in more centralized contexts, increasingly more delegation, which is distinct conceptually from distribution. Okay, John, thank you. I think the final slide now. Oh, it's still not the final slide. So just a few case examples. I mentioned earlier the work that I've done recently with my colleague Ashley and on distributed leadership. Their policy document, very impressive policy document, has a strong normative emphasis on distributed leadership. So it's very centralized, and in their document they talk about principals must distribute leadership. But what we've actually found was that there was more delegation, or what we've called, and others have called, allocative distribution. There was top-down distribution, which is a little different from delegation, rather than emergent distribution, which you'll see in much of the literature and you may know about already. In Hong Kong, there's discussion from Zeto's work about democratic leadership being linked to social justice, and I think that's another normative challenge facing principals. To what extent do their own values address issues of social justice? And here I'm thinking about socioeconomic differences and how you address what is increasingly called the gap in outcomes between children from better off and poorer families. Increasingly, in some contexts, this relates also to issues of migration, race and ethnicity, and may have implications also for gender. So how do you build in those social justice imperatives into effective leadership models? In Singapore, which is another highly centralized system, you'll see the discussion of distributed leadership there being elusive. Again, because there's a lot of prescribed activity in Singapore. We need to remember, though, I'm sure you know this already, that Singapore and Hong Kong are always in the top 3 or 4 of the PISA rankings, and so a subject of interest from researchers and policymakers around the world about, so why are they doing better than us, and what can we learn from their practice that we might or might not include in our own. And then the work of my colleague and friend Megan Crawford, who's now incidentally deputy editor of EMAP, and I'm pleased to be working with her in that role. She talks about the need to balance individual, collective and situational aspects of leadership, and I think that's a useful thought for all of us involved in principal development. Thank you. Can we move on again? Now it really is the final slide this time. I hope I'm doing all right in terms of time. So just a few overview points to round off the presentation. I think these will be very easily understood by all of you. So principals are central actors in schools and education systems. And what we know about the ways in which principals are the conduit for relationships between the external environment and internal stakeholders. I've sometimes talked in my own writing about the challenges of encouraging participation in decision making, for example, inside schools, but balancing that against the accountability requirements facing principals from outside schools, and that can be part of the stress that many principals face. Secondly, and reiterating what I've said already, leadership preparation isn't available everywhere, but where it does, it focuses mainly or exclusively on principals. There are very few formal programs for people of other levels. So I mentioned being an external examiner in Singapore. This was quite a long time ago now. They have a program for middle leaders, development program, which is interesting because it balances subject development with leadership preparation for middle leaders. That's partly to have more effective subject leadership in that context, but also to provide a cohort of leaders with preparation who might be the next generation of principals. And we need to give a bit more thought, I think, in education about the succession planning aspects of principalship and developing people in that kind of way. So the third point, really, to reiterate, is the need to acquire a distinctive leadership identity. And this requires a complex and extended socialization process. And Suzanne, you and I have spoken about doing some research with candidates who are taking these programs, and this might be one aspect of such an inquiry about how they feel at the kind of almost at the psychological level, the socio-cultural level as well, about how has their identity changed and over what period of time. The next point relates to leadership practice needing to be very carefully based on situational analysis, not a unidimensional approach. So again, some of you will be aware of Philip Hallinger's recent work around the importance of context in school leadership. And he's done quite a detailed analysis of different aspects of context. But that notion of context being central to the notions of leadership is increasing. So the former Deputy Director of the National College for School Leadership in England, Jeff Southworth, talks about leadership being sensitive to context. And there are similar points in the writings of people like Ken Leithwood as well. And then finally, novice principals in particular, the ones for whom you have responsibility, require careful support excuse me, and nurturing. But we mustn't also forget that experienced principals also have development needs. So thank you very much for your attention, and of course I shall be delighted to attempt to respond to any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for an interesting presentation. I have gathered some questions here in a Padlet from the audience. So are you ready to get the first question?
I will do my best, Suzanne, as always. Thank you.
So the first question, in your experience, is there a core knowledge base of leadership knowledge that is important for us to educate leaders in?
So I think it's a really good question, and particularly a good one to start with. So going back 20 years ago, I was involved with the National College for School Leadership in England when it began. And it set about gathering information about the nature of leadership preparation in 7 countries around the world that were deemed to be world leaders. And you'll all be interested to know that Sweden was one of those 7. But I wasn't involved in that part of it. I was involved in going to Canada. But so we had Canada, we had the US, we had Sweden, we had Singapore, we had Hong Kong, we had New Zealand, we had Australia. Now you might argue with the selection of those choices, but what we found when all those visits led to reports, and I was involved with David Jackson in putting together a paper to look collectively at what we found in those 7 jurisdictions. And what was significant, we found that in everywhere there was a focus on instructional leadership, or what was sometimes called leadership for learning or leadership of learning. And the rationale behind that was really quite widespread, was that schools are almost unique in having learning as their central purpose. So there's a lot of talk about organizational learning and learning organizations and so on that might apply across business or public sector contexts, but the education is unique in having learning as its central purpose. And so we didn't find any leadership preparation programs in those countries, and I've not found in other countries since then anywhere that doesn't have instructional leadership, sometimes with a different phrase, leadership for learning, managing teaching and learning, or whatever. It doesn't have that as part of the program. So I think that's very, very central and important. The second area where there's more variation, it depends on the nature of the system. So in decentralized systems, for example, in England and also very evident in New Zealand, where principals carry out a whole range of roles that have been devolved to them in relation, they manage their own budgets, for example. They're responsible for recruiting and managing and deploying staff. They're involved in organizing their own admissions processes for pupils. Those issues then become important as well in principal learning. So it's really about what it is you need to know in those contexts. In very centralized contexts, where the budgets are deployed as real resources, not as financial resources, where staff are sent to you, you need a different set of skills then. You still need to have human resource management skills, but that's more about handling the staff in context rather than selecting them and having some responsibility for deploying them, for example, to classes within a school. So that tends to be important. A third area that came through our study 20 years ago and remains important, but varies, is it's a focus on understanding the legal and policy environment of schooling. And this is very strong in South Africa, for example, much less evident here in the UK, but there's still a legal and policy environment that people have to adhere to. And principals are not exempt from following the law, like any of us. And because also we have that unique responsibility of looking after children, sub-adults, if you want to call it that, then those areas are very important. And then the final area also connects to that, is having within the training a recognition and an understanding of the welfare needs of children, and that responsibility has been heightened, hasn't it, by the COVID crisis and the mental health challenges facing students and indeed staff. And principals are not immune from that as individuals, but they're also responsible for dealing with it in relation to both staff and students. So I hope that captures to some extent what we see internationally, but instructional leadership and issues relating to that remain central. And Suzanne, you and I have talked about whether that's central enough in the Swedish program, actually, and no doubt colleagues on the call will have some thoughts about that.
Thank you, Tony. I have another question, a rather big one, but I think that will be the last question so we can move on in the program. But some articles about school leadership in the time of COVID emphasize more soft values and leadership practices. In your opinion, what do you think we can learn from the pandemic regards to principal training programs, content, approach, and so on?
It's very difficult. It's a very good question, very topical, obviously, and the literature and research are still emerging. What can we learn? I think the 2 or 3 things I think I've learned to understand better is that the focus on instructional leadership, which I've just mentioned, needs to be balanced by the greater understanding of the welfare implications of the pandemic and the challenges on children and on families resulting from that, and also on staff. So we need perhaps a greater balance. There's always been some kind of understanding, sometimes reflected in leadership structures, between the focus on curriculum, for example, and a focus on welfare. There's always been some of that. But I think COVID has perhaps helped us to understand a need to rebalance that. Having a learner who, I put it too dramatically for effect, having a learner who excels in examinations but is anorexic or has other kind of mental health challenges, that's not a success. We cannot frame that as a success. So I think that we need to have that kind of rebalancing arising from COVID. The other, we're having in England here challenges. The government, because so much educational time has been lost, the government thinks it's a good idea to extend the school day by 1 hour and to have children coming into school in their holidays. Those kinds of catch-up ideas need to be very carefully evaluated in terms of the extra pressure on the students and the extra pressure on the staff. And what it does is go back to what I've just said. The notion of learning then is seen as more important than the notion of welfare, and I would encourage people not to think in those terms. I suppose the second thing arising from that really is just to help us to develop a better perspective of what we're doing in schools as leaders, and to think about what we're trying to do is to develop well-rounded young people who will be happy, will be well-adjusted, and will contribute to society in a meaningful way. And that is always more important than the qualifications you may have, although I'm not dismissing the latter, obviously. But getting a balance and making sure that we in schools, when we can ever return to the normality of regular attendance in schools, give even more attention to those aspects of curriculum that liberate and empower children. And as you know, Susan, I'm very, very interested in sport myself. It's been a huge impact on my own development as a child, as a young adult, and now as an older adult. But I know it's equally liberating through music. My granddaughter has had mental health challenges, and she's emerging through those to be a lovely, successful musician. I'm delighted for her, obviously, and drama. So the more expressive aspects of curriculum, where people can develop as persons beyond simply gathering qualifications, is another lesson which has been exacerbated from the COVID crisis. So it was a broad question, but I hope those 2 ideas are of some value to the person who asked the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My warmest thank you for today's keynote, Tony. It was inspiring, interesting, and educative to get these international perspectives on the principal profession. So thank you very much. I hope we can continue the discussion another time. Now it's time to move on, and then I will turn to Swedish, but you can still hang around for a little while.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. It's been a pleasure. I hope the rest of it goes very well for you all.
Thank you very much. Nu är det dags för en rörelsepaus. Innan vi tar skärmvila och kanske lite kaffepåfyllning eller lite vätska. Och då vill jag också påminna om, som Ulrika sa vid inledningen, att från klockan 10 ses vi i en ny länk Och länken finns på programsidan och då går vi över till Zoom. Men nu innan vi tar paus så kommer Anna från Friskis att guida oss genom en rörelsepaus som vi hoppas både får hjärtat att pumpa på lite extra och att kroppen får röra sig och vakna till lite grann. Vi ses 10:00 igen.
Hej och välkomna till Friskis och Svettis. Jag heter Anna Eriksson och är verksamhetschef här på Friskis i Sundsvall. Vi bara landar in här, vi ställer oss över hela foten. Vi sträcker upp oss i kroppen och känner att vi blir långa upp genom nacken. Tar ett djupt andetag, vi kommer in. Och vi släpper ut på vägen ner. En till. Bara känner hur spänningarna lämnar kroppen. Sätter ut våra händer. Rullar axlarna på plats där bak. Vi kommer in i rotation. Vi roterar in i axeln. Känner att vi jobbar djupt in i axelleden. Vi öppnar och vi stänger igen. Vi lyfter upp, kommer här. Banar in rörelsen, gör en cirkel med armbågen. När vi känner att vi har en så tar vi med en större del av kroppen. Svävar med här. Känner värmen, smyger sig på, bara behagligt. Det kommer att vara hela tiden. Stannar till, vi lägger handryggarna mot varandra. Vi öppnar upp i bröstet, där har vi den. Vi rundar, vi öppnar. Ta med benen. Vi böjer ner oss. Trycker till. Vi kommer upp där. Vi bara roterar sida till sida. Vi jobbar med nacken. Kan titta lite snett bakom. Snett bakom axeln. Vi fortsätter med rotationen. Vi tänker att vi håller i en boll. Vi jobbar sida till sida över. Lugnt och försiktigt. Du hittar ditt läge. Vi har höfterna kvar framåt. Och vi bara roterar. Kommer in i mitten. Vi smyger ner mot våra knän. Ja, vi trycker oss upp igen. Du hittar ditt djup. Kommer vi till knät eller kommer vi ner till vaden? Spelar ingen roll. Stark i magen. Vi har svanken kvar hela tiden. Svanken kvar. Sätter ihop våra käkar. Lutar oss bakåt. Känner att det drar på framsidan. Kommer med hakan till bröstet. Känner draget i nacken. Titta bak igen. Sista gången. Tittar upp. Kommer upp här. Vi sträcker sidan. Vi håller lite längre första gången på varje sida. Vi håller i här. Känner draget efter sidan. Kommer ner. Kommer upp. Vi laddar här. trycker på lite mera. Vi flyttar ut tyngdpunkten. Sträcker ut. Mycket bra jobbat. Ja, vi fortsätter. Ta en till på varje sida. Ja, vi kommer ner. Vi ska aktivera baksidan på låret. Så vi bara börjar här. Vi fäller i ryggen. Fäller i höften. Vi känner att det drar på baksidan av låret. Vi behåller den här stolta hållningen genom kroppen i hela rörelsen. Vi smyger med våra armar. Trycker upp. Känner att vi blir långa genom kroppen. Och den sista. Och vi kommer upp och vi skakar lös lite. Visst känns det bra? Nu är vi pigga och starka och så kan vi fortsätta konferensen på ett bra sätt. Tack för mig och välkomna att höra över till Friskis och Svettis.